3 and 7, but show up earlier. Ready for next part?
I started the live recording.
Cool.
So maybe?
Yeah, do it.
I think I have one more thing to open here and then I'm ready to go.
I got a brisket. I got one. Oh, okay. 2 months. Yeah. Yes. What's hilarious is like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, yeah, Bastrop County.
All right, everybody ready?
I'm like,
Bless you.
thank you.
All right, just for my own knowledge, who's going to be brave and try to set up some of this stuff? Anybody?
Not right now.
Okay, sounds like you guys may have already set it up and stuff then. So I won't go through the setup. If you want to go look up the 4 Kitchens Emulsify project, let me open it up here. If you go to 4 Kitchens Emulsify, just come in here, find the composer command. Go ahead and go for the Emulsify standalone just to get something up and start playing around with it. Literally like copy and paste this command, and then right after that you type yarn start and you're going with Emulsify. So that'll give you the example components and you can start learning about how it works, mess around with Twig, learn some pattern lab if you don't know it already. That would be step 1. So what I did was I set up an Acquia Dev Desktop site, Drupal 8 site that integrates with Emulsify so that you could see, if you have any questions about the required dependencies or anything like that, this stuff is out here. I have step-by-step instructions as to what you need to do in Acquia Dev Desktop to get it up and running. The reason I chose Acquia Dev Desktop is because it's fairly fast. I could have gone with other methods to set it up locally, but they take more time. So I set that up here, and what we're going to look at is a very basic Drupal 8 site that has only one organism within Emulsify, and that's an image gallery. Right, so here you can see that I have 6 images. It's on a gallery page. I went ahead and hid some of the other blocks that are normally displayed on Drupal. But as I mentioned, when you're building with Emulsify, you're building everything from the ground up. So all of these links up here, they're not styled. You're going to have to figure out, how you want your main menu styled, how you want your navigation links styled. These are the kinds of things you're going to have to think about when you're building it. So it's not for a small budget project, right? You're going to have a decent amount of time to go through and customize everything. As I mentioned, though, Emulsify is hopefully going to be more portable in that when Drupal 9 comes out, when Drupal 10 comes out, the part of this that you're having to replace is that templates directory, and the patterns and your components themselves are still working within Pattern Lab. So that is the hope there, that going forward it would be more future proof. I think I should go ahead and show this to you instead of just running it. So when Emulsify is installed on a Drupal site, you'll do your composer require Emulsify, and then you'll run your drush install script. I have a video out there I think it's actually the first blog post on the Four Kitchens website right now. It's called like installing Emulsify with Drush or something like that. But it's a short 10-minute video that shows you how to set up your new custom theme. In this case, we have custom demo. So I named our demo theme demo. And it's going to be just like a regular theme, right? So you'd have themes, contrib, emulsify. Once you have that installed, you can run the drush script. Your drush script would create your example theme. We have demo. Within demo, you would need to type yarn to install yarn, which is like all the pattern lab stuff and everything like that. After yarn, you would type yarn start. And so let's say you've gone through, you've set up your Drupal 8 site, you've set up the theme, and now you need to hand it off to your designer. Your designer just has to clone the repository down to their machine, navigate over to your demo theme, and type yarn start. Then they're actually given the URLs that are running your Pattern Lab instance. So here, this is my Pattern Lab instance. I don't have very many components at all. I did that on purpose to keep it simple so we could stay focused on just what's required for this gallery. Although we have colors up in this file, I actually didn't use any colors. One of the things you'll need to look at is within the base components directory. We have global, and then we have colors. So in here, you would find your SAS file with all of your different variables that you want to use across your project. Part of what Pattern Lab does is it auto-generates your colors for you. And so this is pretty much taken care of. Obviously, like when you're designing a site, one of the first things you'll think about is your branding, how you want to color it. Then I included the grid component because for a gallery, I wanted to have multiple images displayed in a grid. I didn't want to just have a bunch of images going straight down the page. I went ahead and included the basic links atom. So what I did here was I basically had my D8 site with my two themes. I had the Emulsify theme, and I had my demo theme. And for you, when you're starting, feel free to just go in and copy and paste patterns out of Emulsify. So here you can see I'm navigating to contrib, Emulsify, components, patterns. Within patterns, this is where all of your components are going to reside. Colors is one of the first ones you would look at. Feel free to use our grid system. I think we might actually have a PR out there right now that's going to change the grid system. So you might want to keep an eye out for that. If you're going to copy this over to a new project, you might want to look at using the open PR as opposed to using the ones out here right now. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you're seeing a lot of numbers within our patterns. Is this readable? Did I make this bigger? Nope. All right. I don't know if that's going to go bigger. Sorry about that. You'll have all of your patterns. Feel free to put numbers in front of them so that when you're displaying it to the client, you show them what's most important in each section. In particular, if you're building atoms with the client, come in here, go to View All, look at the atoms on the project. You can also view just one if you want to show them only what a link's going to look like. One of the cool things about Pattern Lab is it can actually resize this page for you, so you can see what it's going to look like, on mobile devices, on smaller screens. Make sure that you didn't break anything. All of this is done at the Pattern Lab level. You haven't even dug into Drupal yet. And then we also have like small, medium, large if you're wanting to test it out, maybe a iPhone or like an iPad portrait, iPad landscape, desktop.
Yeah, those are so instruments.
Yep. And so just copy and paste out of Emulsify is where I was going with that. You can start with the slim, figure out what you want, what you don't want. A lot of clients that are going to go with Emulsify are probably going to want to custom build everything. So you'll be doing that. Let's take a look at a molecule. So the atoms I just took straight from the Emulsify project. Then once I got into the molecules side of things, I'm like, okay, well, I don't have a gallery item. I have images now, but the larger component is going to be the container of these components. So a basic component will have generally a Sass file, a Twig file, and a YAML file. That's pretty much like the bare minimum required to create a component. Here is the add attributes usage. So there's probably a cleaner way to implement this. I did this very quickly, but I just took our BEM function. I created a BEM variable. If you're overwriting a Drupal template, then you're probably going to notice that it has classes set, and you can do that within your Pattern Lab components also. So I took all of the Drupal ones, and then I added BEM to it. One of the interesting things I did here was I took our add attributes function, which just takes, like the parameter additional attributes, and I passed our class into it just so you could see how that's used. But let's see, this is a article. If for whatever reason you wanted to pass a new attribute, you could do something like, foo, and then you could do bar, and then on the attribute side of things, this would be like foo equals bar. And so that's what the HTML generated would look like. And as I mentioned, this doesn't look like a whole lot, but getting it to work in both Pattern Lab and Drupal required a little bit of magic, which is our add attributes function.
So things like roles and whatnot also do it that way. Like roles, like RN roles, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Follow up on it. So that's what I had going on here. Just the base class. Generally, you'll be setting variables in the top of your Twig file. You'll be adding classes, whether it be directly with the BEM function, because if you copy and paste some of our examples from Emulsify, what you'll see is that BEM was actually down here, more like this. So the only attribute that would have been passed is class. But by doing it through the additional attributes, or add attributes function, you can pass other stuff and make it more flexible. I like flexibility. I'm a maintenance developer. I don't want to have to go through and be changing a whole lot of stuff.
So that the add attributes function exists in both worlds.
In both worlds, right? Yeah, and so that's the key here, is that it does exist within both worlds because it did not before.
Right.
And then you'll probably see this within the Drupal templates, just your standard attributes, and then you can do add class, whatever string. Since this is a molecule level, you could continue to use like your BEM function here, but in particular, I had a block, right? So I created a block that I wanted to be able to replace later. This is a super simple example that has only one element within our component. But if you had 5 or 6 elements, you would have 5 or 6 blocks, and you could only replace one later if you want to. What you're going to see, unfortunately, and if you guys can find a better way to do this, I would definitely like to hear about it. But for now, you're going to see a lot of usage where it's still split between Drupal and Pattern Lab, right? You just have to have, in particular, when Drupal generates its components, it'll grab the smallest components first, right? Like your atoms would be generated first. It gets the markup and it brings it back, and then it calls like the higher level component. And so you already have your base markup, which is why you're going to see on your higher level components, you're having to do this, where you're just generating like the raw markup because another component has already generated it. But the difference is that within Pattern Lab, you're having to include the smaller level components and pass in these variables. So you'll have to keep an eye out for that as to when to use which example. I think over on our links, we were able to get away with just a single set of markup and pass the variables into it without having to have that split between Drupal and Pattern Lab. So what you'll see is on the higher level components, you have to do that. All right, and let's see. I left this in here. Where is it? Okay. On this example, there's actually a bug. I left it here on purpose so that I could tell you all about it, and then you could keep an eye out for it when you're developing your own components. Here, we have link attributes, right? We are generating the attributes, and the specific one I want to point out here is the href, right? Is just the home page. And then we also have a link URL that is supposed to be displaying this URL, but because it's passed in via the attributes, this one is actually getting precedence and this one is being ignored. So if y'all start getting into passing in custom attributes from Drupal into Pattern Lab, you might need to keep an eye out for, is Drupal passing this attribute, and am I trying to overwrite it within Pattern Lab in another variable? So just keep an eye out for that. And on your molecules, as I mentioned, you're going to see a lot of wrapper markup, but what you should not see is like base level component markup, right? So you might see divs and articles up in the molecules, but you shouldn't be seeing like image tags, link tags, header tags. Those would all be at the atom level. So you'll see I was using includes here. I don't think I actually used an example of embeds, but you can go look at the other examples. You're going to see embeds when you start having more complex components, right? When you have lots of blocks. I tried to keep this one simple.
Can blocks be nested? Or should I just Google that?
I believe that we looked into it because we also were like, well, can we, nest a block within a block like 2 levels down? Yeah. And I believe the answer was no. Okay. I believe that you can only go 1 level down on a block. Okay. So if you had an organism, you can only replace a block at the molecule level, and you can't do it all the way down at the atom. So actually, I guess we are using embeds in our grid system. So our grid system has a block called grid content, and we replace the content with, like for Drupal, we just have grid content, which is just a straight markup. And in Pattern Lab, we have an array of images that we pass in, and I'm just passing some custom parameters here. So on your, is everyone here pretty familiar with YAML files? Anyone worked with them before? They're pretty straightforward. They have like your parameter and your value. In this case, we have an array. It is, I guess, an indexed array at this point. Not actually sure, but you might be able to create keyed arrays here. And then the modifiers is also an array. And so in this case, you have to create an array of strings of modifiers that you want to pass in. At the organism level, it looks a little more complex. I think I skipped the molecule level in my example, so the molecule level would look something just like this. You know, you'd have image modifiers, an array, and a string. One of the things that you should be thinking about with modifiers is that if you build your design system with like the theory of utility classes, the class that I'm thinking of in particular is you might have a modifier that's called gray, right? You want to make the background gray. So do you create a class that's -- gray and just add that over to your pattern lab component so you can reuse it across all components? Or, you know, do you go ahead and follow BEM strictly and put, you know, your block, your element, and your modifier, in which case you're going to have to repeat the CSS a little bit. You could probably look into using either mix-ins or, you know, like includes in your CSS to make it to where you don't have to actually repeat it. But go ahead and think about utility functions to keep your CSS nice and clean. And then modifiers would be the way to use it. And do it here. Okay, you're actually going to see a little red dot right here. Emulsify has Sass linting built in. So I think when I ran my generation earlier, we actually saw that, you know, our style lint here is throwing errors. It's telling me, you know, I should not have an empty class right here. So that's one way to keep it clean. If you follow it, you don't break it like me. And let's see. So we were using dashes within our block name. So the entire block name here is gallery item. I was trying to follow the pattern name that I gave it at the directory level. And then it had one element, which was its image. And I just went ahead and threw a box shadow on it. Did I not put... Okay, I do not have an example modifier here. But it would look something like this. You'd have your block, you'd possibly have an element, and then you would have your modifier. And if you're doing modifiers, as I was saying, you probably want to do like some sort of include so that you can use it on other modifiers, because generally a modifier is going to be something super simple and straightforward, like make the background gray or something like that. I did not put an example here, but if you wanted to, you could duplicate your gallery. The syntax is something like variation, you know, gallery tilde variation. You give it whatever parameters you want to pass. I found something kind of interesting that I'm not sure if it's a bug or a desired feature, but I found that variations inherit its parents' parameters. So if I wanted to not pass this third image into this variation, I would actually have to declare it as like a blank object. I can't just delete it like I did here. I'd have to do something more along the lines of like that, if that was the right syntax. It would just be, you know, an empty item that's not generated later.
Can you do just like only like all of your YAMLs with variations so you never have a base one?
All of your YAMLs
Like,
said
so
without
they all have
variations?
the tilde, whatever. So they're distinct pattern, like, or distinct YAML files. So they're
They can-
not a parent one that you're inheriting from.
I think your base would just be blank then. I think you have to have a base one.
Do you? Okay.
I think you're saying have a base one but put very little in it.
Or have a base
I
one with
think-
nothing in it, and then each variation can then have the
discrepancies between it, so you don't have that inheritance problem.
Try it out. Let me know.
Yeah.
Let me know how it works. I'm interested to know that answer because that would be helpful.
All right.
Yeah, so you would put your variation. If everything was working here, then you would see, it was reloading the browser. We should be able to scroll down. And now you'll see that we have both our gallery and our gallery variation. I didn't actually vary it, but if I wanted to do something specific to this variation, that's what's going to happen and that's how it's going to look. And let's see, what else do y'all need to know about? I had really wanted to dive into pages. I just ran out of time when I was preparing this example, but pages are definitely the way you want to go when you're prototyping with the client to show them how it's going to look and let them think about it. Because the number one thing that I've learned is that people don't always know what they want until they see it. And so once they've seen it, they can help you change it. And when you do it at the pattern lab level, the cost to get it done is a lot less than if you had developed the whole thing with Drupal.
I have a question, Chris, about pages.
Okay.
You said that you're not using those in Drupal at all. Not as like, I mean, couldn't you conceivably wire up panel layouts, or I think they're called field layouts, the field layout module now to those?
Good question. Try it out. Let me know.
Okay.
I believe that the answer would be that you're bypassing a lot of Drupal functionality and hooks and things like that if you try to do it that way. But I am interested in the answer.
Okay.
So if you have time to try it out, let me know. All right, so that's the pattern lab side of things. Twig functions are within both pattern lab and Drupal. In this case, you'll see that if you want to use a Drupal function, there's a lot of Drupal functions missing. So if you want to contribute to the project, this is an area you can contribute. It's probably pretty easy for you to contribute to these things.
And it's Oktoberfest.
And it's Hacktoberfest.
Hacktoberfest, y'all. Hacktoberfest.
So make sure you're contributing to open source projects. Texas Camp, Emulsify, feel free to go at it. But this would be a pretty easy PR. Go through and look at the Drupal functions, right? They're available within Drupal, but here we only have 2 that are available within Emulsify. We currently have Kint and Link. The reason why they're there is because we had the need to include them within one of our components. But if you don't have, in our case, like a PL Kint, then you can't use Kint within Pattern Lab, and it throws a big fail error. So if you're finding yourself getting a fatal error within Pattern Lab because you're including a function that's not defined, you need to come in here to the Twig components and define it. In our case, you don't actually have to even make it work the right way, right? You don't have to make it work the way that Drupal works. In our case, the link function is literally just returning a string, right? It's not actually generating a link or anything like that. It's just making sure that Pattern Lab has something that it can return so it doesn't fail.
Where is this file?
So it is at the, let me see. I'm in custom demo components right now. So within your components directory, you're going to find all of your Pattern Lab specific information. So you can add new functions. You can add new filters, right? So here's our Pattern Lab T filter. I can guarantee you this is not behaving the same way the T function is behaving within Drupal, but it is working enough that Pattern Lab is not throwing errors and we can still get expected results within our component. But if you find that the T function or something is not behaving the way you expect within Pattern Lab, it's probably these functions that you need to come in and use. So if y'all are not familiar with it, filters are going to have like a pipe and then filter name. And then functions are going to be declared with like them, and then your parameters that you can pass into it.
Does it work with the aliases and stuff like trans instead of T? Or you need to actually create that in there too?
Yeah, so the only thing we've defined here is just T. You can see that we're defining a Twig simple filter with T. And
So
then
we just presumably clone that for.
so you can copy and paste this, create your own, and so now you know the directory to do it in. If you find that Pattern Lab is yelling at you that BEM or add attributes doesn't exist, come in here and look and make sure that the BEM function was actually installed. Maybe Composer failed when you were installing it, and it never made it to actually clone the BEM function down. So I think those are the main ones you're going to be messing with. We've talked about it back and forth as to whether or not we want to use the data.json file, because a lot of people within the community are using it. You might become one of those people. It's basically just a way to define parameters globally so you can pass it to any component. You can also use these within any component if you don't feel like creating all of these within your YAML files. I know that we made a specific decision to not use it within Emulsify, and I would have to double check on the answer as to why we chose not to use it. But so that is there, and it is an option if you want to use it. There's some sample images you can pull from Pattern Lab. You can probably put your own here. I think these will only be available to Pattern Lab. If you're trying to pass stuff over to Drupal, I think these will not make it over to Drupal.
So are you populating your style guide with the YAML files in the components?
Yes. Yeah, so some people don't use YAML files. They only use the data.json file.
Right.
And so you could choose not to do the YAML files.
But you're using those YAML files for something else other than that?
We're using it for just the components. That's like all we're using it for, is just that one specific component. That YAML file defines it for that component. And like I said, if you want, you can use the data.json parameters.
We could turn the data.json into a YAML file and it would work the same way, right? You just,
You could add your own stuff to it, yeah.
Yeah, you could just.
Yep, put whatever you want in it.
Just kind of stuff in there is declared as data files. Is that kind of the way that works?
It's just one big file.
Well, there's a list items and a data and files. So there's data.json and list items.json.
I think the way to do it would be to actually add like new, let me see, what is this? I guess this is an object, yeah, so you would define new properties on the object. And that's the way that I think it's designed to be used.
Well, specifically, there's two files in there is what I was asking.
You're talking about the list items?
Yeah, so we could add our own stuff, right? Like
probably.
Okay.
Like I said, we chose not to do it that way, but
Okay.
It looks like Charles is saying, yes, you can add your own files. And so, yeah, I think both of these are available to you for any of your components. Because we're designing our own design system, so your client might want things to look specific to them. If you want to define like some header options within Pattern Lab, specifically your living style guide, you can come in here and change them here. I think we've cleared it all up, but at some point we had some errors because we were referencing links that didn't exist within Drupal or something like that. So you might want to keep an eye out for that. Maybe something in the header. And I think that's pretty much it for our components directory. The main one that you will be living in most of the time is the patterns directory. We talked about Twig components, everything here. The directory that you should be aware of when developing, but it will more realistically be an afterthought is the templates directory. Most likely, you're probably going to have a designer go through, generate everything in Pattern Lab, and then you're going to come back and generate everything within your templates directory to plug it into Drupal. So here, I just went through and I looked for some specific templates to override. I made my pretty short, include this file with these parameters, and it works. Let me see if there's anything specifically worth mentioning. Probably not. I mean, most of this is just going to be you doing a lot of custom integration, trying to figure out, what's coming from Drupal and what goes into Pattern Lab. And then, like, what variables are available within Drupal, and do you want to make those available to Pattern Lab? I think everything else was pretty straightforward. I went through, where is it? I went through and created, my content types for gallery item. I created a view for gallery. The gallery is displaying the content. I was playing around with it and deciding, do I want to generate fields or do I want it to generate the node? I ended up going with the node because it matched Pattern Lab better in my specific instance. And so you might be doing the same thing. You might actually be changing the view to match what was developed in Pattern Lab. And so when you're developing your components, you'll just have to figure that out. I think I had to do a couple overrides on my teaser display mode because I was getting like this weird submitted by, and the only thing I wanted was the image. And then the end result was that I had a field image was one of my components, and you can see the image displayed there. Then I had my gallery item, which is just a container around it. Within my gallery item, I could have put favorite star, I could have put the title, I could have had any number of fields within that. I just kept this one simple and chose to do just the image. And then outside of that, I had my larger organism, which was the view that displayed all of my components. And I think we're pretty much at time. That's all I got for you.
Wow.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, man.
I had a question. It's been a while since I've worked with this a little bit, but when I was doing it, I remember the Drupal templating was the most difficult part. It was getting everything that goes inside the width, getting those variables mapped over was just, man, I just kept having problems doing that.
Actually, you reminded me. I have a slide or two more with some tips on that.
Yeah, I think I was trying with paragraphs, with a paragraph template. And
Yep. Yeah, so let's see. Okay, we just dug in. Here's some tips. We're using like the Twig dump function to actually like see what was contained in there.
Yeah.
Or Kint or something like that.
Kinting, yeah.
Okay. Another option that I was playing with is the Twig dump function. Pattern Lab actually supports it, but one of the things you need to know about Emulsify is that Emulsify pulls Pattern Lab in the vendor directory, so none of it's committed. It's actually like not part of your repository. So if you want to change this, I listed here how you go in. You're going to find your Pattern Lab directory, most likely within the vendor directory, and then config and config.yaml. Change Twig debug from false to true, and then you can actually use the dump function, which I think I found a little bit easier to use than Kint, because if you have too much stuff in Kint, one, it's super slow to load, and then two, you're like digging around having to find, like the specific thing you want. So I guess I think more in terms of like the dump function. There were some additional resources, so go to patternlab.io if you want to learn more about Pattern Lab. I had styleguides.io, right, because you are developing a style guide. That is the end result, that is the goal. Make sure you keep that in mind throughout the whole process. Let's see. I think we were talking about specificity. That was a good article on, how you should go through and name your components, conceptually what you should be thinking about. I gave credit to our Emulsify 1.0 talk. If you want to learn even more about Emulsify and get some more of the basics, that talk is out there. I also was reading about some design systems, component-driven design. I got the pixels off pixels.com. And now that's it. So any other questions?
You were saying something about drush 9?
Yes.
What's,
You are going to have to use drush 9 if you upgrade Drupal to the latest version, which is 8.4.0.
Really? Oh.
Yep.
Because you said the 8 was broken.
Because drush 8 is specifically, there's an issue that says they will not support 8.4.0 or greater. Because they made some commit that broke drush, and it was something, I think in Symfony maybe, and they chose like, we're not going to refactor the whole project to make it work on the 8x branch, just make people upgrade to 9.
Were they part of the console emulator too? Like they would have to literally rebuild to work with Symfony's
They were going to have to rebuild like the whole thing, yeah. Which they did in drush 9, right? They're like, we did rebuild it.
Alrighty.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Nice job, man.
Thanks, John.
I think that's probably one of the best.
I saw Brandon tapping his watch, so I didn't know.